I appreciate everyone being here today, and hopefully I'll be able to provide you some information about some flexibility in our products. So first of all, when it comes to our overall models, there are two versions of these. So in the iAutomation, which is our factory units and our panel mountable units, we have two categories. It's the PPC and the TPC. So the PPC model is a panel PC unit, which is your stock standard unit, which a lot of customers might know with the PPC-3100 Series, 30 Series, and as well as also as our TPCs, which is our thin client PCs. So the major differences between all these models is that the PPC has a little bit more flexibility in terms of the ranges of the CPU, while the TPC itself is only ranged within probably about 4 different categories. The PPC unit itself also has different environmental stuff for it. So if you have an application where you need to install it in certain areas, we have about 3 or 4 options for you. While the TPC itself is actually kind of restricted being a thin client, even though it actually is more suitable for SCADA-based programming, which is actually an option you can purchase alongside with our web access stuff. So another real positive thing about the PPC compared to the TPC is that the PPC units itself actually has expansion brackets for PCI and PCIe. So if you ever need to add additional cards into the unit, the PPC unit actually is really, really well designed for that, while the TPC itself isn't actually designed or has any inbuilt PCI ports. But a positive thing about the TPC compared to the PPC is that it actually allows for the iDoor modules, which I'll go into a little bit of detail a little bit later on. So pretty much just a kind of brief overview before I show what options you have is that the iDoor module is actually a small little PCM connector that connects into the mini PCIe of the unit. This allows you to increase the RS-232, 422, LAN, as well as add additional Wi-Fi. Even though the PPC unit can have Wi-Fi units installed onto it, that requires a completely different module where the TPC can have an all-in-one bundle. One major differences between the two models is that the PPC models allows for a range between 10 to 30 volt DC, while the TPCs are purely restricted at 24 volt DC. So it really comes down to your application for those ones. So with the PPC, you can kind of have it in different environments, as I mentioned before, especially the 12 volt option. So you can pretty much be running an Atom processor with 12 volt compared to the TPC, which might be the same CPU power, but your power network might only be for 12 volt. Instead of getting a converter, you can directly go with the PPC-3120 unit, for example, which is a 12-inch model. So with the PPCs themselves, they're actually of IP65 rated, which is our stock standard one for our units, which also include with the FPM series, while the TPC itself actually has options for 65 and 66. So this kind of just gives you a different aspect of presenting these to your customers, because I know that with some customers, they do have certain requirements and certifications. So the TPC is actually more well designed for those. And the TPC is actually more designed for factory floors. So you would actually see a lot of these models installed into factory belts. Being a thin client, they're actually a lot slimmer than the PPC. So they're easier to install in almost any spot, which kind of helps out a little bit. And the also positive thing about the TPCs is that they actually start at a -20 to 60 degrees, while the PPCs start at 0 to 60 degrees. So if you ever need to install it in a cold environment, the TPC is pretty suited for those. So with the PPCs themselves, they're actually subcategorized in 3 different areas, which I'm about to get into now. So just a brief overview of them. There's the all-in-one Intel Atoms. So that's generally the Atom, the Celeron, and the Pentium CPUs. We have our all-in-one Intel cores, which is our i3, i5, and i7s. And then we have a configurable panel PC. So the third option, which I'll get into a little bit later, is actually brand new. It's only been around for about a year and a half now. But in terms of the flexibility of those ones, is actually really well suited for any customer. So I'll just go into the first one first. So the all-in-one Intel Atom is our PPC-31 and PPC-30 range. So these models here are actually just kind of our low-end processors. So as mentioned before, the Atom, the Celeron, and the Pentiums. So these ones here are kind of a low budget ones. So if you have a requirement of a customer that needs, let's say, under $2 or $3 grand, the PPC-31 series is actually really, really suitable for those environments. being able to install with operating system that ranges with Android, which the Android is actually in our 6.5 range and our 10-inch range, all the way up to Windows 10 LTSB 2019. So it kind of gives you a different range of operating systems for it. And the good thing about it is that each model itself can have the PCI and PCIe expansion modules installed onto those ones, which, as I mentioned before, beats the TPC in terms of overall expansion, because sometimes what you'll get with customers is that they'll install an application in the field and then realize that as time goes on with technology changes, that it's easier just to install a PCIe card instead of overall replacing the unit. So another real positive thing is that being a flat screen is actually a lot easier to install, and the back of the unit is actually quite small as well, so it doesn't have a bulkier back. So it makes it easier to install in kind of tighter environments, as well as also being able to adjust the 422 and 405 RS connectors in the BIOS option. Yeah. So, sorry about that. So another real positive thing is that with the PPC 31 and 30 range is that we generally have about 2 or 3 options for each size, which can give you the Atom and the Celeron processors for those ones, as well as also some units which I'll go into detail. It's our 31x Series, which is actually just kind of the slim versions of the already PPC units. So some examples of these ones are the PPC 3150 unit and the 3150S. So the difference between those ones is that one unit will be the Atom processor and one will be the Celeron. But in terms of the overall size of the unit, you're saving a couple inches of the actual 3150S, and it actually looks a little bit more commercialized compared to the bulkier 3150 unit. So kind of depending on your application and also depending on who actually sees the unit, you can actually have a more commercial looking SCADA unit in an environment where people can access and see, instead of just a kind of a bulkier design, which some customers might not find appealing. So I'll just do an overview. So this is just a general overview of all the PPC 31 and 30 ranges. So as I mentioned before, we actually have variants of different models. So as mentioned, so the 3150 and the 3150S, the main differences between the two are the Atom and Celeron. So I know that a lot of customers do have CPU checks, CPU pass marks. So this kind of gives you different options on those ones there. So you can get ones that are over 2,000 and over 3,000. So it kind of just gives you different aspects of how to approach your end users, as well as also your environments, as well as also having different options in terms of upgradability across the time. So the one positive thing is with the PPC 3060S series, you can actually get a module for an AC connector on that one there. So if you have an environment where you need a small computer, but you need an AC connector in, you can actually get a small little power module, which can go with that unit itself. As well as also being Android 6.0 is actually quite useful for different applications and also different environments. So generally the PPCs are more used for factory areas, but as well as a model like the 3060S can actually be used more in a commercial area, or places in like hospitals, for visitor checks. So for a unit itself that is purely designed for factory automation, it actually can be flexible enough to be installed in completely different environments. And as you see with the 3150SW and 80SW, we're always expanding our range. We're always evolving and adapting depending on the time. So we're only recently bringing out 2 different models, which is the Pentium core processors. So generally what happened is beforehand in the 31 and 30 range, we'd never have an 18.5. So this is actually a brand new one, which Taiwan has determined that there's a market for it, because if you had to go an 18.5, you would generally have to go with an i3 or i5 processor, or you have to upgrade to the 19. So generally what would happen is a lot of customers would have to reevaluate their budget or reevaluate, the areas where they've cut machinery into. So this is just another good example of, the evolution of our products, where we determine, okay, the market requires this. Let's put our resources in to get the customers this product. So it's really, really great to know that, with our model, we're always expanding. And later on, I'll actually show we're actually further moving into the 23.8 range, which is coming soon, probably more towards the end of this year or early next year, which is actually be in the i3, i5, and i7 range. We haven't hit any of the Xeon yet. I'm not too sure if that's going to happen anytime soon. So just going forward, the next slide will be with the all-in-one Intel Core, which is our 3.1 series, 3.151s, and also 4.2 series. So with our second part of the subdivision of the PPC range, we actually have our all-in-one fanless Intel Core units. So these ones range between 4th gen i3, i5 to 6th gen i7. I know that we're slowly developing 8th gen, but I'm not too sure on what the timeline for those ones be. So the main differences between the units of the Atom ones and the Intel ones is actually, on this one here, you actually have 3 different versions of the unit itself. So the one on the left one is the 3181, and on the right is the 3151. So each model, depending on the variant, actually has different design. So if your application or installation is in it for a tight fit, you can actually save a bit of space using more of the slimline Intel ones compared to the bulkier version, which the one on the right is actually just a replica of the 31 series, but in an i3 processor. So with the Intel Core ones, all models are generally widescreen. So they always start at 15.6 all the way to 21.5. So this kind of just gives you, again, just a little bit of flexibility in terms of the installation, because I know that generally a lot of customers, their requirements, a lot of people are pushing towards the widescreen on those ones there. But just to let you know that the widescreen of 15.6 isn't high definition. It's actually the 21 inches that actually is high definition. But we are in development of a more high definition 15.6, which actually is in the TPC range, which I'll get to at some point. But one difference is between these models and the 31 is that these actually are capacitive multi-touch compared to the 31 series, which is actually just your pen mount standard touch. So depending on where you need to install it, that these ones would actually be suitable for food processing areas, and other ones that which require gloves or different environments that might impact the touchscreen on it. And another really good thing about it is that these ones can support with the HDMI and DP DisplayPort on them, while the 310s, some of the units actually can't have any of those. They're purely VGA. So depending on where you need to install it, having the option there is actually really important, because the way that we're going with technology itself, in 2 or 3 years' time, we're probably going to be using HDMI or slowly move towards 4K. So it's always good just kind of be ahead of the curve on those ones there. Or you can always use a HDMI converter on those ones as well, but ideally they're more designed for high specs environments. So another cool thing is that with the one on the right, you have the mini PCIe expansion. So some of the models don't have access to these. As you can see on the left, there's no port for it. So there is a little bit of a restriction on those units themselves. But it also just depends on your application for that. And the positive thing is that with the new generation, with the 6th gen and eventually going to be the 7th gen, is that we're actually moving to the DDR4 RAM options, which will obviously have an increased speed. And quite a lot of these models actually are capable to go up to 16 gigs of RAM. So if you ever need to give yourself a boost over time, you can always just do an installation that way, instead of having to fully replace a unit, where some of the PPC-31 series is actually restricted to 4 gigs or 8 gigs. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of an option there to, over time, just slowly develop and, give yourself, flexibility. So as previously with the other ones, this is kind of the overall the product range for these ones. So as I mentioned, the Intel Core ones, they are a little bit restricted in terms of the overall number of units. But in terms of the overall CPU power, it's actually far superior than the PPC-31 series. So as I mentioned before, the PPC-324W is coming out. I'm not too sure on the timeline, but that's a 23.8 inch model there, which actually is our first IoT 23.8 model. So generally what would happen is that for anything to get the size like that, we would have to be restricted at 21.5 inch or we'll have to look at a digital signage one, which generally start at 32 inches. So this kind of just opens a bit of a pathway for us to slowly bridge the gap between two different product divisions, as well as also assisting customers that feel like, you know, their environment needs a much bigger screen instead of having to purchase, say, an Uno unit and then connect it to a much larger, you know, display screen. So the good thing about it is that with such models as the PPC-3151, we're actually moving to the 7th gen already. So that one itself is be able to be solved. And I know that we're eventually moving over the 21-inch and the 3211 to 7th gen as well, just to kind of keep up with the times on that. That product part number will probably be a little bit different to what you see here, but it just goes to show that we're always adapting and changing for this. So in the future, if you ever need to have a swap over, or you feel like a 6th gen, you know, i5 unit might not be suitable for your application, you don't have to worry about, you know, buying a more bulkier or a Uno unit and then connect an FPM unit to it. We can kind of start eventually roll those ones out to you, and, you know, give you that, you know, option right there. So as mentioned before, everything is in flat screen and also widescreen. So the high definition really only starts at 21.5, as I mentioned before. So it is a little bit restricted, but I know that the resolution for those ones are generally pushing, I think it's 1266 times 786, I think, off the top of my head. I have to just triple check that. But yeah, so we know that with the 3151 models is that generally we're slowly starting to phase that out in our system. So obviously still having a 4th gen PC is still pretty important, because we find that a lot of customers are still running operating systems from about 10, 15 years ago. So I know that we're eventually moving over to the full 6th gen. So the PPC-3151 might only have a 4 or 5 year lifetime left, because as technology evolves, we want to kind of keep up with the market, and that, you know, the 3151 SW already in production and already be able to be sold, is really important for us, because when the market changes, we have to change, and that's really important for us here in Australia and also in Taiwan. So with the last slide of these models here, I'll be showing you the configuration panel PCs. So these ones are totally different compared to the other PPCs I've shown you today. So these ones are totally customizable in terms of the overall unit itself. So the unit itself actually doesn't have an inbuilt motherboard. You actually have to order a min-ITX motherboard. So the real positive thing about these units is that over time, you can actually manually, or, you know, send it in, you can actually change the CPU of the unit itself. So I know right now we're looking at the 6th gen CPUs. So as time rolls over, you can actually go, okay, I previously bought an i3 model, say a year ago, but I realized my application does require a new CPU. You can actually individually buy the CPU yourself, and then depending on the level of expertise, you can send it in to get an upgrade here, or actually physically install the unit yourself. So the real cool thing about these ones is that these are purely the only, or apart from the 3060S, which is a module, they're the AC connecting for those units. So a lot of customers would have requirements where they couldn't actually convert the power to DC, which kind of left us in a little bit of a shoehole for applications. So Taiwan decided to change the entire 6.0 range, or 6.1 range, which for those that have been buying with Advantech for quite a long time, these models would have been the 6.121, 6.150, and 6.170, and actually moved them over to the 6.171Cs, or 121C, 51C, which is the model you're seeing in front of us. So the real cool thing about this is that since it is min-ITX, you can actually have the HDMI and VGA imports for that, as well as also able to store Wi-Fi cards and MSATAs onto those units themselves. And the real cool thing is that it's purely DDR4 RAM. So we're already having a step ahead. But the problem is that some of the models, especially the min-ITX, is actually quite restricted on the size that you can have on the RAM. Pretty sure the max you can probably get is 16 gigs on those ones. So in terms of some other models, you can go higher, especially I think one of the PPC models can do 32 off the top of my head. So it's kind of one of those models. It's kind of a bridge in between certain models there. So the real positive thing about it is that, as you can see in the photo, is that you can actually have the 2 PCI and 1 PCI expansion port already pre-installed on the unit. So you don't really have to worry about sorry, I keep saying that word. You don't have to worry about only being restricted to 1 PCI expansion port on that one. You have actually got an option to have 2. So I'm pretty sure the bottom tier of that one there actually has a PCI on that. So you can actually just go, all right, cool. Over time, we realize is that we're running out of LAN ports or RS-232 or 422. You can actually just install that yourself, or just set it in for installation. So in terms of the overall way that Advantech want to present the iFactory and the PPC range, is just to make sure that we give you as many options as we can with the unit itself. And also a real positive thing about the unit is that if something faulty does happen over time, where the motherboard might degrade over time, or you might get hit by lightning, you can actually just don't have to worry about having the entire unit repaired. You can actually just have one primary focus of the repair, which is the motherboard. So it actually reduces the lead times in terms of A, replacement parts, and B, repairs. So compared to the other models, is that if something was faulty with the unit, the entire unit itself will basically become obsolete. Because if something would be wrong with the motherboard in terms of something was blown, or over time, you would have to replace the entire unit. At least with these models here, you can just focus on purely the motherboard and get it sent out and have a reduced timeline of replacement. So it kind of helps you out a little bit in terms of the overall time. Obviously, it is a little bit more expensive than a few other models and a little bit bulkier than other models. And also the cool thing about these ones is that these are the only ones that actually have a fan for these units. So, because I know that some customers, although fanless is really helpful, some environments do require fans. So this kind of allows us and allows you to let your customers or your co-workers to know that, okay, cool, we're looking for a 7th gen PC, but we need a fan unit for it. Instead of having to worry about mixing and matching units, you can purely go towards the PPC-61 series. So it just kind of helps you out to expand on those ones there. So with the next slide, this is just the overall themselves. So the downside of these models is that since it is new, we are kind of restricted in terms of the overall amount of units. So as I mentioned before, these ones just generally just replace the PPC-6120, 50, 70, and 90. Because Taiwan realizes that instead of creating an entire new product range, it's actually easier just to evolve and adapt a pre-existing product range. And a negative thing at the moment is that it is a little bit restricted in terms of the CPU list that we have. So I've just kind of done the variant of a couple of models that we have there. So I know that we're eventually moving over to the i7 ones, which I'm just waiting for Taiwan to let us know the part numbers for those ones. So the cool thing about it is that, as I mentioned before, that is, say if you buy the i3-6100 TE unit with the CPU, and you realize that over time that the CPU is not able to handle your application, or you want to actually use that unit in a completely different environment, you can actually purely just buy the CPU yourself and then actually install that on your own computer there. So what it will do is, a lot of customers would have that if over time you'll need to upgrade your unit, instead of having to spend XYZ for an entirely new unit, you can actually cut costs and actually just purely buy the CPU, and then depending on your co-workers skills with computers, you can just purely install that yourself. So then that kind of just helps out with a different range of things. So that's the first part of it with the PPC units itself. So I'm going to go into the TPC units, which is our thin client ones. So these ones are a little bit different compared to the PPCs because they're purely a thin client. So these ones here are mainly designed for factory floors, like conveyor belts, as well as also looking after more SCADA-based environments. So these ones here might be connected to a lot of PLCs or a lot of ATOM or Ethernet EKR units. So these ones here, the really cool thing about these ones is that they actually have the option to come with pre-installed software such as the web access, SCADA, or HMI. So those ones there are basically just a web browser controller that can be accessed by the unit. So it will allow you to determine what's active, if you need to change anything, as well as also being able to use the COSIS, which I know that quite a lot of customers use. I do know that these models are suitable with other SCADA-based programs, so there's no real restriction on those. But I know that the positive thing is that we can actually have those pre-installed for you, which might be able to save you a little bit of time and hassle on those units. So the main difference is that with the TPCs, there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of the size of the units. So as you can see in the top, we actually start at the 5.7 range compared to the 6.5 for the PPCs. But the problem is that the TPCs haven't moved over to the 23 inches yet. So they are kind of stuck at the 21.5. And the real cool thing about these models is that being such a thin client, you don't have to worry about, high CPUs with these ones. So we generally start an entire range of these TPCs will purely be Atom processors or Celeron processors, because Advantech know that when it comes to certain SCADA programs, you don't require a large CPU power for these ones. So there's no real point in us offering a customer or offering you an i5 model in a certain size when we can just provide a TPC model for you, and also make sure that the model itself is well designed for your requirements. So compared to the PPCs, these ones actually have a CFast and mSATA connector for these ones. So as you can see here with the SATA SSD optional, so the back of the unit is actually quite thin, and the way for you to get an SSD into that, you actually buy an expansion kit onto that unit. So in terms of lead times, it can be a little bit of an issue where if you require an SSD, you do have to buy an extra part for it. But having the ability to purely have an mSATA or a CFast on it kind of gives you a different option for that unit. So if you ever need a quick turnaround, you can always just purely get an mSATA and just get it out the door. And as well as also a real negative thing about the unit is that there is no PCI expansion ports on any of the TPC units. So what it makes up in terms of hard drive expansion ability, it actually is reduced in terms of the PCI ports, what it can do. Compared to the PPCs, which a lot of the models have have one PCI port on them, the TPCs sadly don't have enough room for them. But a real positive thing is that the iDoor optional accessories makes up for this, which I'll go into a little bit later. So pretty much what happens is on the back of the unit itself, there's a little slot on those units there where you can actually remove and install your own iDoor modules onto them, which the iDoor itself is connected to a PCM device, which obviously goes inside the unit. So one positive thing about these units is that they actually are designed, as mentioned, for factory, probably water treatment plants. So they actually do have their own audio systems for alarms. So having connected to web access SCADA or HMI or different other SCADA programs, having an inbuilt audio device is actually extremely important compared to some of the PPC models which actually don't have that application. So unless you have someone manning the spot all the time, you might miss out on certain errors where something might be going wrong, which the TPC can purely let you know by its sound. But a downside of the TPC is that compared to the PPC, it only has 24-volt DC. So you are a little bit restricted on those units, but these ones are purely designed to go into environments where 24-volt DC is there. I do know that some of the PPC units, the TPC units themselves, have actually been going into food processing plants, which purely 24-volt DC goes into those ones. There are some models in a different range that actually do have IP69K, but those ones are a lot bulkier. But I do know that Taiwan are kind of looking forward to actually developing ones that are suitable for them. We previously used to have sunlight readable versions of the TPC models, but that got moved into a different product range. But I'm hoping that over time they will actually start to bring that back out. So the cool thing about these ones is that they start with either 65 or 66 IP rating compared to the PPCs, which purely have 65. So I know there's only a slight difference in terms of the ratings themselves, but sometimes that can be extremely important for your requirements of on the field. It just gives you your insurance that whatever environment you put it into, it's going to handle the climate or different elements that people will touch with. So as I kind of mentioned before, this is just kind of a short overall range of the units themselves. So until you get to about the 15-inch range, that's when you slowly start to enter the i3 range. So that's a bit of a negative compared to the PPCs, where you can actually look at certain models earlier in terms of the CPU ones. But the cool thing about it is that being a slim line, some units will actually be a little bit cheaper than some of the PPC units, because with the cool thing with the TPCs is that they actually will have inbuilt RAM on those ones. So if you purely need the unit just to run without any hard drive, you can just pick and play, purchase it and not have to worry about any accessories going into the unit. So in terms of the overall time saved in our BTOS area, so a PPC unit with, let's say, 4 gigs of RAM and 120 gig SSD, so it'll probably take about 15 to 20 minutes to build, while the TPC itself will probably take about 5 to 10 minutes to build, because we don't have to worry about having to grab parts or install, because it's already pre-done. And if you never need a hard drive, it's basically the testing itself would only be about an hour, which is our normal burn test, compared to maybe an hour 20. So let's say if you're local here in Melbourne and you desperately need to pick up a unit, the TPC unit can easily be put through the BTOS units, BTOS room, and sent out straight away. And then when you have the unit, you can just plug in and play because it's already pre-done. Some of the TPC units can go up to 8 gigs of RAM, which the cool thing about it is the motherboard sodium slot can be removed. So what some of the PPC-31 series has, where it can increase to 8 or 16, you have the option to still increase these models over time. So the cool thing is that the TPC-2140 is a high def model, but it's also running at a dual core processor. Because I know that generally with some of the models in the PPC-4211 range, those ones only starting at i3 and i5, which can become quite expensive. And those ones are actually really the only high definition ones in that range. So if you or your customers ever looking for a downgrade version of the high definition unit, we do have that option for you. So it kind of just allows you to kind of weigh up 2 different options for you, which, in terms of how, the way the world is going, having different options and having the ability to budget properly, it's really, really important for us to make sure that we can provide that for you. So in the next slide, I want to give you kind of a brief overview of some of the iDoor modules. So this is just kind of some of the options that we have. We have around about 25 different models of these ones, and sadly they all can fit in one power slide. So the cool thing about, as mentioned about the iDoors before, they do have a PCM card, which you can see connected to all these different devices. So this unit will go into one of the little mini PCIe ports of the unit, which then would connect to the back of the unit. So a lot of the units themselves might be restricted in terms of maybe 2 RS ports, so one RS-232 and one 422/485. So you actually can kind of add additional ones onto these ones. So it just kind of gives you reassurance is that, okay, cool, I'm looking for a thin client model, but I realize that I might actually need 4 RS ports. We can actually just provide you those options in an iDoor module. So you don't ever have to worry about having to mix and match, or having to worry about, okay, now that my application is all set up, I have to totally change what product I have to use because I'm restricted in terms of RS ports. And another cool thing is, compared to the PPCs require a completely different wireless module to be installed on. So what you would have is you have kind of like the little PCM cards in this photo and then connected to antennas on the back of the unit, while the TPCs themselves can actually just have the iDoor module for Wi-Fi installed. Basically, it looks a lot cleaner compared to the PPC models because the PPCs just have a smaller antenna sticking out, while the TPCs have a full color-coded version of those ones there. So in terms of presentation, I know that sometimes, depending on where it's installed, it may not be as important, but depending on where it is, it's always just kind of good to know that, it's clearly labeled for anyone that's working on the units. So one of the things we got also with the 4G ones as well, so that also, just depending on your application, that can also be an option for you, which helps, as well as also the 1-port Ethernet one. We do have a 2-port one on there as well. So if you ever feel like you need to connect extra, let's say ATOM 62 series onto those ones, or 60, sorry, you can just, direct connection for those ones there. So again, as I've continuously mentioned, it's all about flexibility in terms of our product range on these ones here. So recently, probably about within a year, Taiwan decided to bring out a whole new total product range for the TPCs themselves, which actually is really, really cool. And I kind of wish I thought of it. So they brought out a new product range known as the TPC-B500 Series. So pretty much the unit itself is just the box modular. So in the photo you see here, the top one, the box modular, is the physical unit itself. So that's what we call the TPC B500 model. So that model there is purely HDMI, DV port, iDoor modules. Actually got one iDoor module and the RS2 ones there. So these ones here actually have a really cool option of being a module that can be removed. So these models require the FPM B700 series, which I'll show a description of what those look like in a second. So what will happen is your B500 series would actually plug into the FPM unit. And if you ever need to realize that over time, okay, our 12-inch screen is kind of getting a little bit too small for our application, we want to move up to 17 inches, you can actually detach the TB500 off that unit and install it onto the 15-inch version of that FPM. So it kind of just helps out in terms of cost saving. So instead of with the TPC and the PPC models, is that if you physically have to change the entire unit itself, you can just go, all right, cool. Our only change has to be this TPC unit. So we just have to take this off. Okay, let's order in a 17 or 15-inch screen, and then we can plug and play. Everything in that module will be saved on there, obviously, having inbuilt. So it just makes it a lot easier for you to just swap and change things. And the real negative thing with these ones is that they're only purely in Windows 10. So being such a 6th Gen 1 Tier 1, it's only focusing on Windows 10 for these ones here. So it is a little bit short on the foot compared to some of the other models, but these ones here are actually used for visual display in themselves. So one primary example of how this would work is that you have your TPC B500 series on a factory line, and let's say that's running a SCADA-based programming, but you have another screen that is a few meters away, which needs to be connected to that. The TPC can actually, via cords, can actually share the screen of that one there and interact with each other. So this actually can be your primary in terms of factory automation. So you can actually have 1 or 2 screens attached to this, and then if any alarm happens, that would actually be signaled to your primary. So you actually can work out what's going on through the SCADA programming, which is actually a really cool design, and I kind of wish I thought of it. So as I mentioned, this is just kind of the overview of the entire TPC 500 series itself. So the 2000 series starts at the Celeron. So again, these are all the box modules for these ones there. So in the photo themselves, you can actually see the different variations of these ones here. So the one on the far left, that's actually the TPC 2000 series. The middle is the 5000 series. And the one on the back is actually just a different variant of the 5000 series. So the one on the back one is actually more for video display. So that would be purely just, the core unit itself, HDMIs, and just an iDoor module and Ethernet cord on those ones there. So that basically can be your bridge between the two. So as I mentioned before, if you have your primary, the TPC 5000 or 500B, you can actually just purchase one of those small units as a shell unit and then have that connected to your primary on that one there. So another thing that these have compared to the other ones is that these are actually the first TPC and PPC ones that actually accept M2 SATA ones, compared to some other models which only have the M SATA on those ones. So I know how technology is changing, that we always want to get a little bit smaller. So you don't really have to worry about having to purchase kind of a bulkier SSD, although it is an option to have it, which is really great. As well as these ones can also go up to 32 gig DDR4 compared to some of the other PPC ones. So yeah, as I mentioned before, we're only restricted in terms of Windows 10 and Wes 7P. So it is a little bit harder in terms of, you have to make sure that your overall is at Windows 10. But it also is just great to know that this model here can be act as a primary to other environments, as well as also still having the functionality of the TPCs in terms of the alarm units. I know that we're slowly moving forward towards the 7th gen over time. I think that will probably be out in a year or two. But it's always great to know that in terms of how the generation spans every 2 years, we're always moving over to a new one, is that you can just set yourself up going forward with a TPC B500 unit with a 6th gen, let's say, i5 unit, which will probably last you about 5 to 6 years. And if you ever need to swap over the unit itself in terms of screen size, you can just change over the FPM side. So as you can see in the bottom section, you actually have the different variations of the FPM. So starting from 12.1 all the way up to 23.8. So the 23.8 model actually is on for sale right now compared to the PPC and the TPC ones, which the 23.8 one either doesn't exist or isn't out yet. So this actually kind of gets us foot in the door a little bit quicker than a few other models, though it might be a bit restricted in terms of if you want the 23.8, you need to be on Windows 10 or Web 7P. Another really cool thing is compared to the other models is that our 15 inches or 15.6, sorry, it actually starts in full high definition compared to all the other models, which only start at probably 15.6 in a certain TPC range or 21.5 in the PPC and TPC. As well as also making sure that we have an 18.5 high def version, which we actually don't have in the other ones. So the way that we're going with a lot of things, high definition is extremely important for certain environments as well as certain application. So it's always great to know that we are, one step forward in terms of providing you that option there without having to worry about lead times or, it's coming soon. Yeah, so thank you all so much for attending this presentation for the TPC PPC units. I hope you guys learned something today, and I hope everyone is staying safe. If you feel like messaging any questions, please let me know, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. But thank you all very much. I hope you're safe, and hopefully the weather is a bit kinder to you than here in Melbourne. Thank you all so much.